far away.
Hello, thanks for coming to my talk. Today I'm going to be talking about how we can maybe fix our concepts so as to understand bias and agency, or like be able to think about them more clearly. And some preliminary prospective results that I've gotten by trying to apply a particular method for this purpose over the last few months. And caveat emptor, this is very meta, a very philosophical and very speculative talk, so you have been warned. And the part of the talk is that first I'm going to introduce the problem, or what I see as a plausible problem. Then I'm going to introduce the method that I'm trying to use to solve this problem. Then I'm going to talk about what results I've gotten so far and what I intend to do next. So what is the problem? So we want to develop some alignment as a science, like agent foundations, science of foundations of agency, okay, core theory of mind. And we want to develop this kind of thing so as to allow us to reliably build intelligent systems that do good rather than do bad, even if we are not capable of supervising them. And how would we go about doing this? Like loosely speaking, we are gathering various pieces of the puzzle, trying to put them together, trying to look at the problem from different perspectives. And you can look for the right mathematical formalisms, like has been done in the Miri tradition until relatively recently. We can look at modern machine learning or deep learning systems and try to develop a theory of them, such as like is the stick of the singular learning theory. PIBBSS or alignments of complex systems take a slightly different approach, and they try to learn from intelligence and adaptivity in the wild and hope that this will generalize in some way to very powerful minds that don't exist yet. And speaking of not existing yet, we have this problem of epistemic access, that we have access to only one or maybe two examples of general intelligence, depending how we count. And these are like humans as individuals and humanity as a kind of collective mind. And it's extremely difficult to study a broad phenomenon relying on a sample of size 1. And since we lack epistemic access to the future things that we need to reason about, and there are meaningful senses in which we need to get it on first try, we have a problem. This is this nice illustration that I like from the post, the space of systems and the space of maps, where on the left we have like a metaphorical space of intelligent systems. I want to also interject a word in that space is a very loose metaphor, and I have very many problems with this metaphor, but it's good enough for this purpose. So on the left we have space of intelligent systems, or maybe a more appropriate term would be the space of adaptive systems, such as animals, humans, various current ML systems. Could maybe include, I don't know, some kind of societies. And we also have like this region labeled as AGI that doesn't exist yet. And on the right, we have the space of maps. So various frameworks, ways of thinking, conceptual toolboxes, domains of science, even engineering, that we use to study some parts of this space of intelligent systems. So we have like social anthropology and active inference, statistical physics. And you can think about a kind of mapping that puts a region of the space of maps and maps it to a region of the space of intelligent or adaptive systems that it describes accurately. And our current problem is that the maps that we currently have, they probably don't generalize to the AGI case very well. And so we would like to develop better maps for AGIs from our current maps. And the problem with that is that typically we adapt our thinking, our frameworks, our habits of thought by interacting with the phenomena pretty directly. And since we can't directly interact with the phenomenon that we want to get to know better, we can't use this normal way that science progresses. So what are the alternatives? Maybe you could deliberately refactor our ways of thinking, such that maybe we can hope for it to generalize better, or be able to get faster feedback once some kinds of more reliable feedback loops are accessible. So as I said, typically we adapt our thinking for reasoning about some phenomenon by confronting it and gaining feedback sufficiently rich to correct our thinking. And you can think about an analogy to a locally driven search, akin to natural selection. So change is driven by local pressures that are not necessarily aligned with adequacy for some future purpose. And evolution has no foresight. Exaptation, so repurposing some adaptation for a new purpose, doesn't happen in advance. It's like we see on the illustration on the lower right. The mammalian forelimbs were adapted or exapted for various purposes, for grabbing things, for walking, for swimming, for flying. But these exaptations develop only when a need arose. And there is some kind of history dependence in the way that concepts develop across time. That incumbent ideas can influence how the change of thinking proceeds, as well as, for example, social factors. It's like, for example, some concept can be adapted as to increase the legibility of a field to outsiders. There are good reasons to believe that, for example, the switch from talking about friendly AGI to aligned AGI was made for that reason. I can go into more details later if people want. And concepts that rely on each other. Concepts rely on each other, sometimes creating messy problematic patterns of interdependence, similar to messy evolutionary adaptations that are very unlikely or perhaps downright impossible to evolve away. And the concepts that we use to think about powerful minds are usually like either folk or pretty theoretical or inherited from some other disciplines. So for example, concepts of belief, value, preference, mind, agency, optimization are either adopted folk beliefs, the beliefs that we use in natural language to think about like our daily experience kind of, or they are inherited from some other fields that are not necessarily going to be appropriate for thinking we try to study, such as concepts of preference and optimization. And as I said, as we can't get feedback from something that doesn't yet exist, to adapt them, we need to rely on some proxies, on anchors, to keep our thinking on track. And you can use current general intelligences and current not quite general intelligence or not quite intelligence, ML systems like maybe economy. But there are risks to this, in that we have a very small sample size related to the space of systems. This risks over-indexing on the human case. As I said, over-indexing on available examples. So maybe we need to do something analogous to genetic engineering on our concepts to break out of this inadequate equilibria. And the hope is that by deliberately re-examining our ways of thinking and devising better concepts, we may be able to make them more adequate for thinking about minds in general. So what is the method? And the method is called a hermeneutic net. It was introduced by Zvi in a post a few months ago. And this is a speculative method for refactoring our thinking about some domain, some topic. And this is not quite the way he introduced it, but it's kind of my personal take. So this description slightly diverges from his, but I would say this is very much in spirit. So we take some domain, topic, idea, or concept that we are very confused about, but have a rich structure of ideas around it. And we are trying to figure out, okay, what are the roles that this concept or different facets of this concept play in our thinking about the relevant domain? How does it relate to other concepts? How does it constrain other concepts and is constrained by other concepts? Having done some of that, we can proceed to another concept. For example, one of the concepts that resurfaced in the analysis of the previous concept, and do this again. So say we start with some concept X, then we try to explicate the relevant meanings or facets of it, the laws that we place in our thinking, and so on. What would we lose if we erase it from our mind? How is it inadequate for what we wanted to do? And some other concept that it is entangled with. Then take one of those and the same thing again. Another way to do this, that was the way that I proceeded like maybe 2 months ago, but eventually switched to the previous one, is to wait, am I repeating the slides? Apparently. Okay, never mind. So another way to do this is to face a recorded trace of reasoning in the wild. So for example, this may be a write-up, an article that introduces some confusion that exposes some pattern of reasoning that we want to examine. And we try to identify the load-bearing terms or expressions in this trace of reasoning, explicate their intended meanings, the notations, connotations, and assumptions that they introduce, maybe implicitly. Whereby load-bearing, I mean ones that are insufficiently clear, where much hinges on how we choose to make them more precise. And the confusing them will probably gain us a lot. And we need to understand the general gestalt and dynamics of this reasoning, and the conclusion that it seems to inevitably run into. Then we try to narrow down on the concepts that resurface in the process of this analysis, such as the ones that the load-bearing terms rely on, maybe implicitly, and apply step 2 to them, where step 2 is basically what I introduced on the previous slide. So take some concept, such as the one that resurfaces in the analysis in step 1, build some small chains of reasoning that are representative of the structures of ideas we have, and apply step 1 again. And this will form a kind of cycle or net. And how is this different from like just doing relevant philosophy or just conceptual research? So I would describe this as a kind of iterative analytic exploitation that will focus on some specific aspect of our cognition that seems in need of refactoring. And we work on it analytically by trying to understand the confusion for proposing any constructive solution. And we also, of course, may work constructively aside from doing the hermeneutic net, obviously. Maybe it's plausibly even good to do this to some extent, but it's not the point of the method. And in this process, some other concepts will resurface. And when we conclude that the returns on further analysis have diminished sufficiently, we can proceed to some other confused concept. And we will continue to doing this while looking for maybe promising areas to approach constructively, or some patterns of confusion that suggest a need for large-scale refactoring. And there are many caveats to this, more than I'm going to list here, but here are some. So probably the eligible parts of our thinking, presumably what we call concepts, at least some of which we call concepts, are just the top of an iceberg, of our cognition. So for example, John Wentworth has this book, White Letter Physics, where he conjectures that apparently learning physics and learning physics well leads people to develop many interesting skills, many of which are tacit, very hard to communicate, very hard to even point at, but that are very useful even outside of physics. And this is probably at least one of the reasons why we see it more often to be the case that a physicist transitions to work in some other domains such as biology, philosophy, or cognitive science, rather than the other way around. For example, Schrödinger and Leo Szilard transitioned to work in biology and had some successes. Schrödinger especially, I'm going to discuss him later as an example of somebody who may be a kind of precedent for the thing that I'm trying to discuss here, but applied to understanding some aspect of biology in advance, rather than cognition in general. Still, since these are our concepts, they are what is available to us more directly than the depths of our cognition, and this is what we can and need to work with. Also, I'm being explicit that I don't want to like repeat the mistakes of logical positivists from 100 years ago, in that the goal is not to look for crisp definitions consisting of necessary and sufficient conditions for category membership. This is not mathematics. We want to use mathematics for talking about minds, but we shouldn't expect that, oh, we'll find this very precise definition of every concept that we want to study. We're not trying to attain mathematical rigor, but it's not to attain everywhere when talking about a class of complex adaptive systems such as minds. So yeah, we don't want to walk into the traps of logical positivism. Rather, the goal is to achieve a conceptual toolkit adequate for reasoning about minds. So what may happen if it goes well? We may realize that some fragment of our conceptual web is riddled with illegible problems, leading us to use this part of web very cautiously. Maybe we may find some promising areas to investigate more directly. It's like maybe the most helpful. We notice a concept spanning problem in our conceptual web, and after maybe a lot of thinking, we'll find a ways to fix it. Maybe this is like the biggest hope. Or we may realize that some concepts that we have taken for granted go the way of either logism or ether. So there is no such thing. There is some understanding of the phenomenon, such as like fire or a propagation of light, that renders this concept or question obsolete. Information, so we managed to formalize or specify some subset of the meanings of the concept. Maybe it will go the way of fish and bird. So there is some natural axis of classification that makes us prioritize one way of categorizing the phenomena in different circumstances. There is a good reason why we no longer consider bats to be birds or whales to be fish. And in the most extreme case, it may turn out that our entire mind-specific ontology is mistaken and needs to be more or less completely worked out. I used the wrong word here. I should say more or less completely overturned. I don't expect this to be the case, but we need to remain at least open to this possibility. So, and how can we know we're making progress? Well, the reward in this endeavor, if and when we get it, is pretty sparse. Because as I said, the thing that we're trying to study doesn't exist yet, and it's far away in the future. But for the most part, in the beginning, we have no choice but to rely on some subjective assessments, which are definitely much better than nothing. That maybe we see that our conceptual clarity is increasing, that our thinking about it becomes easier. We have a clearer image of how concepts relate to each other. We get to know the conceptual territory of our confusion better, which is more of a meta progress, maybe. And we know what problems to focus on, so they produce interesting and seemingly relevant results. And at some point, greater ease of translating these informal concepts into formalisms. It is also a hope. And knowing how mental elements can build from non-mental elements. And results. Although maybe results is too strong of a word. And well, TLDR, I split this into object level and meta level. So I analyzed kind of 11 concepts or concept clusters to various degree of detail. One that stood out to me as like somewhat easy present in a talk like this is looking nature of beliefs and values. I'm still confused about the type signature of beliefs and values. Of course, I'm not even sure whether to what extent what is adjacent to these concepts as they currently exist in our conceptual network is the right way to go. But I identified some load-bearing concepts whose clarification might help with deconfusing them. And as far as I can tell, I made meaningful progress on solving some confusions around those concepts. On the meta level, I concluded that our confusion runs much deeper than I had anticipated. And it increased my credence in our current ways of thinking being inappropriate. Of course, this doesn't imply strongly that the hermeneutic net is the way to go. And it turned out that following this method is somewhat slippery for me, but I think I can get better at it. And the results are currently limited, but they are enough for me to provisionally conclude that it's worth sticking to this method at least a little bit longer, at least for myself. So what is this thing about looking nature of beliefs and values? One thing that I concluded by doing this method. So like actually beliefs contain values in a sense. That if we are updating our beliefs so as to keep them more in sync, or so as to make them more in sync, or keep them in sync with reality, it's like this is purposeful. There is we can talk about this again, like in terms of some fractal structure. So the very mechanism I think about as epistemic, as trying to match itself to the world, is actually value driven. So this duality is kind of fractal, and even like maintaining a stable percept, like a stable representation of something in our visual field, it is also purposeful. It requires very fine-grained control on various levels. And dually, kind of values contain beliefs. Like a value presumes some ontology in which the values are expressed. There's also a presumption of some idea of what is possible. And if we engage in some kind of reflection or idealization process, like reflecting on our values, it seems that it's, at least phenomenologically, feels like it is similar to trying to discover some truth about the world, and this is an assumption very hard to unshake. Sorry, this is intuition very hard to unshake, even for me, even though I have a pretty strong anti-realist views about ethics. But what do we mean by beliefs and values? So you could say that roughly values maybe are the teleological or purposeful aspects of some system. And I'm using this concept of values here very roughly to refer to this whole cluster of related concepts. And whereas beliefs are roughly aspects of the system that are kind of meant to, and again, meant to, which means kind of purpose, to match, reflect, or represent some aspects of the world. And under this definition, this includes even perception. What confused me the most 3 months ago is also what confused me the most today. And analyzing, explicating my notions of beliefs and values ran me into a wall in which I couldn't like make them anything much more precise than just think about them as predictive devices or elements being postulated in some mind, whose functioning, whose underlying implementation I don't quite understand. So what confused me the most 3 months ago is also what confused me the most today. Maybe I'm repeating myself. Never mind. So I'm interested in what is a non-magical story of how what we would consider values are constructed from non-values, and the same for beliefs. And a go-to example for this kind of story is this image from Terence Deacon's book Incomplete Nature, where he presents this as a realistic and minimal example of a system where we can clearly point to some kind of teleology and function of components, even though it is very primitive and built from very understandable and kind of prosaic parts. So in this system, it's called an autogen. And we have an autocatalytic set, where an autocatalytic set is a set of molecules that catalyze each other's reactions, that produce more of themselves. These are, to be clear, molecules of different kinds. It's not just one kind of molecule. It's a set of different kinds of molecules. And as long as there's sufficient substrate to maintain these reactions, they produce more of each other. They are in a very synergistic relation, but only as long as the substrate as there is sufficient substrate. Because once they run out of substrate, then there is no more matter to produce the new molecules from. And usually this kind of reaction eventually, well, it basically always eventually halts because the reaction runs out of substrate. However, an autocatalytic set, there's no like experimental proof of concept, but at least it's very plausible. An autocatalytic set could be constructed such that some of the molecules that are being produced are proteins or protein-like structures that spontaneously assemble into a shell that surrounds the autocatalytic set, such that first it is like protected from external disruptions, and also it doesn't use all of the substrate in the environment because the shell limits the amount of available substrate. And in this case, we can clearly point to what specific parts in the system are doing. So the internal molecular autocatalytic set, its function is to basically produce more of the system. If the shell breaks, immediately new molecules are produced to replace this part of the shell. Whereas the function of the shell is to protect the internal autocatalytic set from dissipating, or like from using all the available substrate. And it has simple cellular-like properties in that if we break it, it has tendency to self-repair, or if you break it harder, it has tendency to split into two smaller autogens. So this is, I think, a very interesting example of how we can have some small non-teleological elements, and from then construct a system that has more of what we would consider like purpose, or some kind of consequence directedness. In this case, obviously, the consequence is pretty simple. The goal that is directed towards is pretty simple. It's just self-preservation, maybe replication, but it's still some kind of goal directedness. And here I'm going to say some stuff about inadequacy of our current ways of thinking about these topics. So the formalisms that we have, such as expected utility theory, various invariants, but also most of the alternatives usually presume these value things and believe things as basic, without explicitizing how they may be implemented or what they are made out of. Not even matter, but even some kind of computational implementation. Whereas intentional stance or dispositionalism, which are two common ways in philosophy to approach these topics, treat them as just useful predictive modeling devices, without trying to explain what is it about the things that are being described, that are being modeled, that makes these predictive devices, such as the concepts of values, beliefs, and so on, goals, purposes, work in the first place. And my current best and provisional and very unsatisfying guess or gesture would be that concepts and beliefs and values point at an important axis of these mental elements that can either aim to fit the world or aim to fit it can either aim to fit itself to the world, or can either fit the world to themselves, where the former would be beliefs and the latter would be values. But this trying maybe, and probably usually, is distributed across the cognitive system. It's not just a property of this single thing to which we can point, even if we can point to it. And however, like, this is still very skeletal. And when we are talking about beliefs or values or whatever in the mind, referring to something in the world, this is in the philosophy of mind described or called intentionality. So whatever is the right picture of beliefs and values, it will require an understanding of how they intend the world, or like how they can be about stuff in the world, or even about stuff in the same mind. If for example, we have some introspective beliefs. And this may be, of course, a first problem, as is often the case, reflecting the state of mind or our confusion. Maybe there is no such a thing as this kind of glue, and maybe it only appears to be a thing. But even if it's not much of a thing, and only seems like a thing, this seeming needs to be understood. I also want to mention that, I want to mention this here. Now let's go ahead. And moving to choice, coming back a bit to the values. The values are typically often expressed in terms of preferences, and preferences are, as they are inherited from neoclassical economics, defined in terms of consistent behavior in situations of choice. But what is it that makes the situation a choice? So, like, one way to think about this is in terms of the degree to which one agent perceives another agent as constrained in their available behaviors relative to the concepts used by the former, to some relevant level of detail. So, for example, if I perceive an agent as having two choices, the left button and the right button, I think that it is determined that this agent will press one of the buttons, but I can't tell which one. But this also presumes some kind of concepts that I'm using about that this is this agent, this is left button, this is the right button. and some relevant level of detail in that it only matters to me which button will be pressed, but not by which particular movement. So the choice is like whatever systematicity or non-noisiness is left under constraint. And as the agent behaves reliably in their choices, they start being perceived as constrained by their choices, by their tendency to make particular choices. And maybe we call this preference. That is one way to think about this. But like when a prediction is based on an inferred preference is violated, this forces the agent that is doing the prediction to reconsider the assignment of preference. And this again hinges on something like the predictive model used by this agent doing the prediction, which is again a kind of belief. So this is again a kind of circularity in our concepts. So we have preferences which hinge on choice, but the best way I could think about as making sense of what a choice even is by simulating this setup of two agents, and one of them using beliefs and values are again paired to each other, as I will show on some diagram later. But we are not only applying this perspective to other agents, we apply this perspective to ourselves as well. Maybe it is the case that we perceive ourselves as under constraint or unpredictable, and then notice that we behave reliably and infer that we have some kind of preference. I think some psychologists speculate like that. But it's not guaranteed. Maybe it is, but maybe there's something different at play. Maybe choiciness is something more than just degrees of freedom in a predictive model. But if so, what is it? Is there some sense in which an agent has like a subjective perspective within it, within which it has a kind of freedom? Do we need some kind of appropriate account of free will reconcilable with the deterministic universe? At least like, okay, the physics right may be deterministic, but from our subjective point of view, it doesn't matter. At least once you like overcome some kind of hopefully very brief existential crisis that some of us go through when they learn about determinism or something. Speaking about subjectivity, it's interesting like that it's not clear what would make an agent like ourselves have this kind of choice-enabling internal perspective, like assuming internal point of view. Subjectivity seems to be like a term that we use to distinguish between things that seem different from different perspectives, but these differences are difficult or cumbersome to discuss in terms of something that is objectively measurable. And a go-to account for a kind of meaning of subjectivity has until recently, maybe even still was like something like global workspace or working memory. But now this construct seems somewhat questionable. Here I'm linking to a talk given by Javier Gomez-Lavin, which was around the conceptual problems around the concept of working memory. And these are like actually more empirically informed. It is actually a much more empirically informed talk. So it's not just like doing armchair philosophizing like I'm doing here. This is not quite the same as the meta and heartfulness of consciousness, still, but it is plausibly somewhat related. One thing that I feel like I confuse myself about is some kind of homunculus problems, which are related to this kind of subjectivity. This is like maybe an example of how this hermeneutic net method allowed me to make some kind of something that I consider conceptual progress. In that, so what is a homunculus problem? Studying Abram Dembski, the homunculus fallacy is a terrible picture of the brain. The taint talk of subjective experience falls into the fallacious pattern of experience versus the experiencer. To recite it, when I'm trying to talk about my experience of something, when I'm trying to distinguish myself from my experience, it's incredibly hard to talk about this in a different way than as if this internal experience of mine were laid out on some screen that is then seen by my inner eye of the mind. Maybe not mine. Maybe I'm not explaining this well. Abram's post has a good a good example in which this is discussed. But I came to think that this homunculus problem is similar to something like fallaciously reified potential infinity, that there are like many potential levels of necessary cognition, and cognition can take an aspect of itself as an object, and in this way another perspective is constructed, maybe like a higher order or like an outer perspective is constructed, and this changes the incumbent aspect of cognition. But there is no infinite regress. There always is some outermost homunculus, so to speak. And this homunculus is not being perceived, but it can be perceived. And it is, when it is perceived, there is a new order of perspective constructed, a new homunculus, so to speak. If this is unclear, I will later link to a write-up when I discuss this. Yeah, so as I said, the outermost loop is ineffable, and one is aware of it only illusorily, potentially. And this seems to imply some kind of infinite regress. But and this is because it can always be taken as a percept, constructing some new outermost perspective. And here is a kind of snapshot of the trajectory that I've been detailing here. So we started with some beliefs and values, realized that they are entangled, and they are overfilled to intentionality. The interest of that values are kind of grounded in the concept of preference, which relies on choice. But this preference is one aspect of values, and it is grounded in choice. And choice seems to be either, in order to make sense of choice, we go either to subjectivity, or if this set up with two agents, one modeling or predicting the other, which again hinges on beliefs. So we have this kind of cyclic structure of our concepts, and there are many more. So this is still a work in progress. And so far, as I said, I have analyzed like 11 concepts or concept clusters, and intend to continue doing it in some significant capacity. And some other stuff I've been thinking about is like, what are some problems with the concept of optimization as it is typically used in the alignment discourse? What are the properties of minds that might be distinctive of minds relative to non-minds, so that we can use them as trailheads for the theory that we want to build? How do the concepts of agency and the mentality mindedness interact with each other? And here's a link. I will drop a link to the slides, either, yeah, probably in the chat. So what next? My current focus or kind of semi-agenda, so like finding an appropriate reductionist account of such things like intentionality, subjectivity, choiciness, and many others, try to minimize magic confusion around those. And once I'm done that, maybe then I will want to proceed more directly to these concepts that are more hugging the query of agency, such as beliefs and values, but also remain open to the possibility that this whole provisional ontology may be woefully confused and may need to be reworked completely. And in general, continue analyzing by confusion in some capacity. And why even hope that this may work? I would say that there are several historical examples in that, for example, Charles Darwin, when you think about it, when his discovery of evolution, or like his discovery of a theory that later became developed in the full theory of evolution, proceeded like that, he didn't do experiments. He was mostly patiently observing and thinking about what are the mechanisms, what might be like some causal processes that would make some species morph into other species. And this led him to writing on the origin of species and other books where he speculated, and his speculations were pretty precious of his time. Another example that I mentioned previously is Erwin Schrödinger, who in 1942 wrote a book, maybe 1944, wrote the book What is Life, where he was pondering what might be the molecular properties of the molecular basis, of the molecular substrate of inheritance, of reproduction, of the very basic things in biology at the time where it wasn't even clear what is the basis of inheritance. People were speculating maybe it's proteins, maybe it's DNA, but maybe you actually, I'm actually thought that it was proteins. But Schrödinger a decade and a half ahead of the discovery of DNA, predicted several properties of DNA and in the infrastructure, so to speak, that it relied on. That was later proven to be like surprisingly on the spot, surprisingly on point. And there's also Mark Baldwin, J. Mark Baldwin, who I think he and other biologists at some point were wondering about a new factor in evolution, which was a kind of folding of the tendency to learn specific adaptations within lifetime of an organism, and this ability to learn would then produce changes at the level of the genome. Broadly speaking, if there is a selection for animals capable of learning a certain adaptive behavior, then there would be a selection for animals that learn this quicker. And in the limit, and actually not in the limit, but in some finite number of generations, this selection for animals but more capable of learning this behavioral pattern will eventually lead to animals that are pretty much or almost, for whom this behavioral pattern is pretty much or almost innate. For a long time, this is just speculation, and it wasn't based on any specific observations or mechanisms, but it later proved to be pretty much correct. So I'm working in PIBBSS, and if you want to like get in touch, shoot me an email. I'm currently putting out the hermeneutic net analysis here under this link. And if you have any feedback or like some possibly useful stuff, you can shoot me an email. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, we now have an opportunity for questions, both from in the room and from participants online. Any questions? Q&A. Right, we have a question from Ariel Cheng. What do you think of active inference?
Broadly speaking, I think active inference is very interesting, but I currently don't have a sufficient understanding of the relevant math that would allow me to like state an informed inside view on it. I am familiar with it to some extent.
Cool. Nice. I'm happy to say some more words on that if there's no other questions. Why not? I'll use the opportunity to give a hot take on active inference that maybe Mateusz can also respond to.
Yeah.
For those of you who aren't aware, active inference is a framework for trying to understand agency broadly, and yeah, try and make kind of more sense of this entangled mess of beliefs and values. It's pretty confusing because it takes lots and lots of different ideas from like different streams of thought and tries to synthesize them into one agglomeration of questionable success. But the particular idea that I think a lot of people focus on, and it's most related to this talk, comes from inactive theories, and it's an idea that beliefs and values can be seen as kind of two sides of the same coin, or in a different, more precise way, maybe, that you can view a person not as having, or an agent not as having separate beliefs and values, but instead a set of priors, and their priors have a different level of fixation, a different relation with each other. And then certain priors have the property that they're more fixed than others, and the ones that are more fixed are ones that, if the world were to be different, the prior would result in action that changes the world rather than a change of the belief itself. So, for example, if you have a strong prior that your body temperature is around 37 degrees Celsius, if this is a fixed prior, this would mean that if you see some kind of fluctuation, right, your body temperature might be higher or lower, for example. Instead of now changing your prior in order to update on that evidence, you instead take some actions to try and change the state of the world. So you might have some kind of homeostatic effect, which takes the temperature back to 37. So this similarity with belief here, where a belief is also a prior that you match to try and minimize the error between your prior and the world. But here, instead of adjusting your prior to the world, you try and adjust the world to your prior. So suddenly action and changing of belief are kind of seen as two different ways of affecting priors in the world, and beliefs and values are no longer seen as different. And I think that general idea is pretty interesting and influential, and kind of has a bunch of things to say.
I'm waiting for your hot take.
And the maths is honestly a headache and mostly wrong. It's worth ignoring the maths and just taking that high level idea and seeing if you can do anything with it. Or if you're feeling brave, coming up with your own maths to try and actually make that idea make sense rather than read what's been done. But yeah, that's just a hot take. I'm curious, Mateusz, if you had any thoughts on maybe just the inactive part of that.
The inactive part of that, which mean that as opposed to representational?
Well, so the inactive part is the thing that I mentioned, basically, this idea that values and beliefs are actually two instances of a more general underlying thing, rather than any kind of specific formulation of that idea.
I mean, the thing I discussed. Well, it's interesting that I did at least like explicitly make this connection with the thing that I was discussing about values containing beliefs and beliefs containing values. This like seems to be an interesting complementary idea to this.
Mm-hmm.
And also it is I think it probably fits pretty well with the ideas of active inference that emphasize this kind of minimization of free energy or prediction error on various level of a kind of hierarchy and add various interfaces that are like considered as something like Markov blankets, and that you have this interplay that is kind of belief-like and kind of value-like on various level of the hierarchy of the brain and body in general.
Mm-hmm. Cool. We've got some more questions.
Yeah.
Guy asks, to what extent do you think philosophers are already implicitly doing things like the hermeneutic net, either individually or collectively?
He asked about collectively specifically.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. Maybe I would expect. So maybe this will like say something about like my kind of, so that might be seen as a prejudice to like some aspects of philosophy. But I think I want to say something like somewhat provocatively that if philosophers were doing something like hermeneutic net collectively, I would expect what I read in the in the Standard Encyclopedia of Philosophy about topics that interest me to more often feel on point rather than kind of pointless speculation. To be clear, I don't want to like blemish philosophers as a whole or like or SEP in general. But I very often feel like when I read some Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it seems to be chasing its the writing seems to be chasing its tail unproductively and being focused on distinctions that to me seem completely irrelevant and pointless. But I would expect that this perhaps this does happen to some extent. Have I looked into inferentialism? Another question from Giles. have I looked into inferentialism at all? Yeah, the meaning of our concepts driven by the inferential connections between them. It's like a way of thinking. I was thinking actually about this, I was thinking about this to Abram like 2 weeks ago. As far as I understand, inferentialism is about meaning. Yeah, the meaning of our concepts is determined by the inferential connections between them. I mean, this seems like too much of a. This seems to me to be like too much of a coherent disposition, like too strong coherent disposition, and that seems to assume that okay, there is no reality out there. And actually, there is something that still determines our perception, still determines what you observe, even if we start believing in it. And I think inferentialism, as I currently understand it, doesn't do justice to this. I'm curious about Richard's question. The shell constraint self-limiting, self-repairing, self-replicator seems pretty. What's the it's okay to read, but just his. Okay. Yeah, Richard, can you say more about how this may be pretty dangerous? Maybe I can. I think I understand you as meaning that if the environment changes, such as like the pH gets lower for whatever reason, then the shells will become less stable. And yeah, of course, this is the case. And that whether a particular kind of protein monomer will form into a polymer depends on somewhat like contingent factors, which is also a limitation of this kind of autogens in that they are not capable of kind of intentionally directing their movements to places where the conditions are more favorable. But yeah, this is like a very primitive example. Could you imagine an experimental protocol that would tentatively validate your process, as from Camilo, SEG being more productive than that just discussing with someone? Yes, and as I know you, I think you may be a good person to talk to about this. Yeah, I would definitely like this to be more of a, to some extent, to be more of a collaborative exercise. In that it seems to me that people's bubble, that a person's bubble and prune are usually to some extent not quite aligned with each other, and that people are good in producing some kind of ideas, but they are not necessarily good in criticizing these kind of ideas, or at least they are less good at criticizing the ideas that come from themselves. So yeah, designing some kind of protocol like that, or like making a hermeneutic net process more collaborative would probably be a good idea. At least it's definitely good to try it. Okay, from Mesa. What do you imagine the artifacts of your research would look like? Assuming you continue down this direction for 6 months or 1 year. Seems much harder to create research artifacts for field-like research. Yeah. I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure about this. The best I can imagine, well, this is somewhat ambitious, but to produce some kind of, okay, so we are currently thinking about this in this way, but we can think about it in this way, in this different way. And if we think about this in this different way, then suddenly some other confusions that we have around some concepts related to lines dissolve away, because this new way of thinking is just better. It's pretty clear that it produces greater conceptual clarity. And this is one kind of artifact that I would imagine being good. Other than that, like if this kind of process or the kind of concepts that may be discovered or fixed proves to be more amenable to some kind of formalization, and this formalization tends to be useful for some reason, then yeah, this would also be some kind of validation. So Ariel, okay, so Clem responded to Ariel.
I'll just say that for people who are looking at the recording, yeah, the error asks why I think the math is wrong. And I replied that most of it is kind of like okay to read and just has some blatant mistakes. Occasionally you find something that's actually very, very difficult to read or near impossible, which just feels like they're obscuring it or hiding behind their mistakes. But I linked to a paper called The Emperor's New Markov Blanket, which you can also look up, which is a good breakdown of the multiple ways in which the maths that current people working on active inference doesn't work out. That's not to say that there's not an approach which takes the same ideas and makes it mathematically worked out. It's just that hasn't been done. Great. I'll give one more chance for some question. Oh, we have one here from Ariel again. Can you read that, Mateusz?
Yeah, what does contact with territory look like in your research process, if any? Yeah, as I said, the reward signal in this process is pretty sparse, which is kind of sad. But like probably the main contact in the territory is some kind of internal consistency that I'm trying to develop or understand some idea better. Or I can see whether maybe this can be explicated this way, but this doesn't work out because if I apply this changed idea for these purposes, then it doesn't work the way I intended. Yeah, it's something like, how to say this concisely. When I'm trying to change some aspect of my thinking, so that I can think more clearly about some aspect, about some topic, then I use some kind of subjective judgment of whether I can think more clearly or whether my thinking is getting more or less efficient as I'm applying these changes. That's probably the shortest way to say this.
Cool. I think that's all the questions. Thank you for all the questions, everyone.